Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Mayor Keneal Management Board meeting. My name is Tom O'Connell. I'm a representative from Maryland and will be chairing today's meeting. I will note that given some of the issues that pertain to Maryland, that I may need to step down, and if I need to, Bob Beal will come in, but I'm going to do my best to stay up here for the duration of the day. Would like to request that anybody that has cell phones to either turn them off or put them on silence. That'd be great. Everybody should have received an agenda and would ask the board's consent of that agenda. Is there any suggested changes to it? Seeing none, the agenda will stand approved. We also have our proceedings from our August meeting. Are there any suggested changes to those proceedings? Seeing none, the proceedings from August will stand approved. I'm going to turn it over to Bob Beal, Executive Director, who's going to comment on the new conflict of interest policy that was approved at the August meeting. Bob?
Thank you, Tom. As the chairman mentioned, this is our first meeting of the full coast after the new conflict of interest and financial disclosure policy was approved by the policy board at the August meeting. So part of that was that all the legislative and governor's appointees fill out disclosure forms on their financial interests and involvement in fishing and NGO community. And I think all of the commissioners that are participating in this board have done that. Those forms are available on the ASMFC website as well as in the notebook out in the hall. So if anyone wants to review the financial disclosure forms of the commissioners, those are available for review. I think there is only one individual, Mitchell Feigenbaum, that's indicated that he processes more than 10% of the coastwide harvest of American eel, and what that means is that under the new procedures, Mitch will be able to fully participate in the dialogue of this board and ask and answer questions and comment on motions. However, he will not be able to make motions, second motions, or participate in the state caucus prior to a vote. So that's the new procedure that has been identified. I think this is the first board that it has impacted this morning. So the only other procedural issue is meeting-specific proxies aren't available or aren't able to vote on any final actions that are being considered by this board. So, if we get to those, we can identify those individuals. Thank you, Tom.
All right, thanks a lot. Any questions related to that? Mitch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, commissioners. I just had one question, and that is, Bob mentioned that commissioners who are recused cannot caucus or vote. I'm certain that at least in the legislative and governor discussions about the issue, it was fairly widely accepted that commissioners are free to confer with guests or folks in the back or really anyone that they choose during caucuses. And we've seen over the years many times where folks at the table refer to a colleague or some other person in the back. So recognizing that during the time that there's a caucus on a vote, I will in fact step back from the table. But I just was wondering if we needed to clarify the fact that commissioners are free to seek advice, guidance, opinions, counsel from pretty much anyone they want. Is that in fact the policy? And if not, I would suggest that it should be.
Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Commission doesn't have a policy on who the commissioners can seek guidance from during a caucus or during any of the deliberations of the Commission. That's up to the individual commissioner. There have been instances when individuals have approached commissioners at the board during a caucus, and I think the commissioners have not necessarily always appreciated that. I think that's not the position of the staff or of the public to approach commissioners during a caucus. If the commissioner gets up and seeks guidance or counsel, I think that's appropriate, but it seems to be maybe not desirable for the public to come to the table and approach commissioners during a caucus.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. So, as I follow this, a commissioner would not be barred from participating in that conversation away from the table even if they were prohibited from the vote based on their ownership.
I'm not sure I understand your question, Craig. Is it that you can go to the audience and talk to your fellow commissioners, or is it a discussion with audience members?
Well, I think the point that Mitchell was making to the commission was that it seems like there's a different, and I don't want to speak for him, but it seems like there's a different threshold for a commissioner who may have an ownership level that they've declared. So I don't remember exactly what you said with regard to this new rule, but it seemed to me that what you were saying was that the individual could participate in the conversation here, couldn't vote, and couldn't participate in the deliberations of the caucus prior to the vote. And so the scenario that I think Mitchell was bringing up was that there are occasions when someone actually might leave the table, go to the audience, and ask a question. I don't know if that's so or not so, but I thought your response was that we don't restrict someone from doing that prior to a vote as part of their caucus. But in this case, I think the rule for a commissioner would be different. Or am I wrong?
Well, I'm not sure I still understand the nuance that you're speaking of. It sounds like, you know, if a commissioner wants to go to an audience member and ask them questions prior to a caucus, I think that's appropriate. I think if, you know, the three commissioners, or the commissioners that are eligible for the caucus put their heads together before a vote, be it, you know, 1, 2, or 3, and depending on recusals and attendance. You know, if there is an individual that has an identified conflict of interest, he or she should not participate in that state-specific discussion prior to a vote. It would be best if they remove themselves from the table, let the remaining commissioners decide how they wanted to vote, and then come back to the table once the vote is cast.
Thank you. So from that, I'm taking that that individual would then still be out of bounds no matter where they are in terms of the remaining caucus members seeking out advice.
Yeah. Now I think I get the nuance. Let's use the example of the real world we're in right now. If Leroy wanted to know Mitch's opinion on how he should vote before a vote, and Leroy wanted to seek that out from Mitch, yeah, I think that's up to the commissioner, but it's up to Leroy, for example. But the policy did not go into that level of detail.
Thank you.
All righty, moving forward. We got public comment period. Anybody that wants to provide a brief comment to the board on items that are not on the addendum, all right? As we go through the deliberation on the addendum, if time allows, we may seek public comment, but recognizing that we've already had extensive comment, we may not either. So anybody who wants to speak on something that's not on the addendum, yes, if you'd come up, sir, and introduce your name and your affiliation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and the American Eel Board. My name is Jeffrey Pierce. I'm with the Maine Elver Fishermen's Association. I was just asking for some consideration today on Maine staying status quo. We've done a tremendous job in cotton gear reduction and license reductions over the years.
Excuse me, sir. It sounds like you're going into an item that's in Addendum 4. Can you clarify to me how this is not related to draft addendum?
I was going to discuss, with all the cuts we've taken, turbine mortality is not on there. Is considered the #1 threat to this species, and I don't see it on the agenda.
Okay, if you want to make a brief comment related to turbine mortality, that's fine.
I was hoping that in the last meeting in August, we would handed out a thing requesting for turbine mortality to be put on the agenda, or outward migration. U.S. Fish and Wildlife cites this to be the biggest problem for American eel. And the fishermen seem to be taking it on the back, and I see nothing happening on turbine mortality, and we'd like that to be an agenda item or considered.
For today?
If possible, we did request it be put on the agenda at the August meeting.
All right, well, let's see how the meeting goes today, and if time allows, we can have a brief conversation on that under other business. But at this point in time, we understand the issues related to turbine mortality. I mean, we've been working with the standing bodies to try to advocate those issues back to our states. I know in Maryland, there's a lot of conversation related to that, to some of the FERC relicensing of some of the major dams in Maryland. So if time allows, at the end of the meeting, we'll allow a brief conversation to see if the board wants to, take this issue up in a different manner at this time, okay?
Thank you for your consideration.
You're welcome. Anybody else from the public that would like to comment at this time? All right, seeing none, we're going to go into the other parts of the agenda. You'll see that item number 4 relates to a proposal from North Carolina. I think, Louis, you're going to present that proposal to the board. Thanks.
Very quickly, thank you. And welcome everybody to Connecticut. Thanks to Connecticut for hosting. Hopefully this will be fairly simple, I hope. Kate has done a good job sort of summarizing it in the 3 bulleted points on the thing, and I'm just going to go over it briefly. In Addendum 3, there was a requirement for a 1/2 by 1/2 inch mesh requirement. And what North Carolina has had for years is just have a 1/2 by 1 inch, 4-inch escape panel. And the pot can be constructed of 1/16, 1/32, 1/64 inch mesh. And so what we wanted to do was go back and go with the 1/2 by 1/2 inch pot. Some believe that may be less restrictive than what we had in place prior to Addendum 3. Based on some of the discussions I've heard, is that you probably get as good a culling in a full 1/2 by 1/2 inch pot as you do if you have a 1/32 inch pot with a 1 panel. But just a lot of it depends on where the panel is actually located. So what we wanted to do was we moved forward with rulemaking to go ahead and codify the rule in Addendum 3 to go with a 1/2 by 1/2, and that's when we were informed that we were not supposed to become less restrictive than we were when the addendum was approved. I think you could argue either way if it's less restrictive or equal to if it's equal to the current conditions required in Addendum 3, or whether it's less restrictive. I don't know that it really is less restrictive. I had a talk with my technical committee representative, who's our chairman to the advisory panel. They like the 1/2 by 1 inch escape panels, and what it would be my intent to do would be to require those panels, allow the fishermen to use those panels, and maybe even proclamate requiring those panels if we run into a concern. So my hope was to be able to continue with our rulemaking process, go with the 1/2 by 1/2 inch panels, which is required in Addendum 3, and then move on.
Thanks, Louis. It's my understanding, Sheila, that the technical committee has not had a chance to review this proposal. But if not, do you have any thoughts you would want to share to the board?
No, we've not reviewed this proposal, and we have no recommendation for the board.
All right, board discussion on North Carolina's proposal. Rob and Mitch.
I just know that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just know that in, I think it was 1995, our eel harvesters approached us and made the request to go to the 1/2 by 1 inch. So, although I don't know of any study that shows the effectiveness of a 1/2 by 1/2 versus 1/2 by 1, they certainly were concerned about having too many small eels. Now, again, there's no study involved, but that's been the case in Virginia since about 1995. On the other hand, I know that if the technical committee hasn't looked at this, it's certainly something that would have been status quo for North Carolina had it been in effect at the time Addendum 3 measures were adopted.
Thanks for that perspective, Rob. Got Mitch and then Richie.
Yes, it seems fairly simple that if at present, North Carolina fishermen in any significant number are in fact using a smaller mesh than half by half. Then by going to the half by half, they're going to become more conservative, in which case letting them take away the escape panel seems to be a fair approach that would probably be somewhat neutral, somewhat balanced in terms of the overall take. On the other hand, if the technical committee assesses the situation and finds out that 99% of the fishermen are at half by half already, then all that's really going to happen from this request is taking away the panel, which would then be less conservative. So it's really, that's the one piece of information that I'd be curious to hear, how many people are under the half by half presently. Hope that was clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Mitch. Richie and John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm a little confused. Is this not a request for conservation equivalency? And if that's the case, the normal process would be to go to the technical committee first and then to the board. Am I missing something in that?
I'm not sure if this is being viewed as conservational equivalency or not, but based upon the limited comment already, it seems like the board could be better informed if the technical committee had a chance to review it. And I was going to ask Lewis as to the timing that you need this decision. Lewis?
Well, I didn't realize we'd made a mistake. I didn't realize we'd made a goof. If we'd have been compliant with addendum 3 with the 1/2 by 1/2 inch pot, we wouldn't be here. So again, the question is, and I understand Mitch's question, I don't know what percentage of our potters have less than the 1/2 by 1/2 with the 1 by 1/2 inch panel. I would imagine most of them are fishing half. Marty might know. But we're in the process of rulemaking to implement this. And so it's already gone through public hearings and various other things. So I'm kind of in a scrape. If this is not going to be, if I can't do this, I'm not exactly sure what I do. Because we can't go back and modify it without having to start the process all over again, and that'll be another 1.5 years. So I really don't think I think it's conservation neutral. And like I said, we have no problem encouraging the panels, the escape panels, for those that are concerned about having smaller eels, and really wouldn't even have a trouble proclamating the required. I'd like to talk more with Marty about that, talk with my fishermen, but if they're in agreement, we could maintain the 1/2 by 1 inch panel, down the road. But I kind of need something quickly, and I'm sorry, that was my fault. I mean, I think it was Kate discovered it, or that we had done a little bit of a misstep. But it is kind of strange that you're held to a more restrictive standard because you were more restrictive, and then when the plan comes out and you want to be compliant with it, you can't without board approval. So I'd sure appreciate your support in this request.
All right, Marty, I saw you nodding. Can you provide a little information as to how many guys may already be using the 1/2 by 1/2 inch?
The law has been 1 inch by 1/2 in North Carolina for quite a while, and they had those 4-inch patches. Put them on the wrong side. They put them on the bottom end instead of the top end, which there was no requirement where they put the patches. And the other problem, because you're going to get, is North Carolina produces a lot of male small eels that are about 12 inches, 13 inches in size. They will escape out of the 1 by 1/2. They will not escape by 1/2 by 1/2. So what you're going to create is a lot of the males that actually need to go out that become half silver in the fall. They will not escape. We can have no market for it. We can't buy them because there is no market for those eels. So really, the fisherman is wasting his time in fishing those eels. So, and I don't know how many people fish 1/2 by 1/2. I haven't seen anybody that fishes less than 1/2 by 1/2 in North Carolina. So.
All right, thanks a lot, Marty. Got John, David, and Walter. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Between this slide and what Marty just said, that answered a lot of my question. I was just curious as to whether any escape vent studies have been done. It just seems that from what Marty said there, that you definitely will catch more small eels with the 1/2 by 1/2 inch other than the 1 by 1/2 inch. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to
make sure I was remembering correctly that were we 1 year into a 3-year phase-in period for this? And I think I raised my hand before, Louis explained how deep they are into a rulemaking process, but these are the kinds of things we want to hear from the technical committee on before we make a decision, at least I do.
Thanks. And Walter?
What if we approve this for the coming year pending technical committee review for, our next October or something, where we can, they can continue with the process and hopefully come up with something that's okay, and we'd have plenty of time for review for 2016 if the technical committee doesn't like what North Carolina comes up with, we can just do it for 1 year.
I mean, that's going to be up to the board. I know just listening to some of the feedback in Maryland in regards to mesh size changes that it requires an investment in different gear, and if we allow this 1 year and then decide not to, it's going to be a lot of potential investment loss. So I think, Louis, did you have your hand up again?
Well, the requirement is a half by half. Is anybody more restrictive than that?
Kate is saying yes. Georgia, at least.
So, I'm perfectly happy with a 1 year reprieve and then be able to work with Marty and the industry to come up with, the addition of that panel, but is everybody going to have escape panels in their pots too? If I'm the only one, that's fine, but because we had it before. But that's something we could work on and report back.
1 second, Rob. I got you, and Mitch. I think one of the struggles of the board is later this afternoon we're going to be looking at draft addendum 4, for which we're being asked to, reduce harvest. And I think that's the question that I've been hearing from several board members today, as to whether or not this proposal will result in an increased harvest or not at a time that we're trying to decrease harvest. So, I got Rob and Mitch, but I think after those two comments, it'd probably be good to make a motion and see how the board votes on this issue. Okay, Rob, and then
thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comment was only to Dr. Daniel that they wouldn't be the only ones. So, again, in 1995, we implemented the panel, the inch by half, but also have half by half in the pots. So I wanted to just respond to that.
Thanks. And then Mitch?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out that I believe Representative Varabin, certainly in some of our communications to the commissioners over the last 2 meetings, I pointed out that the relationship between the mesh and the size limit is not working out perfectly. We've been pretty candid in our own state, as well as telling commissioners or officials in other states that there's still a lot of eels that are being harvested below the limit, and maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there are eels being harvested below the size limit that are nonetheless coming from the half by half mesh. And it just raises the point that as a management measure for the future, we need to try to tighten this up and make sure that we have a regulation in place that matches the conditions on the ground. So if I was in a position to make motions, which I'm not, I would be happy to make a motion to extend the North Carolina the following year, an extra year to resolve this. I would also be suggesting that North Carolina, just as the chairman suggests, that North Carolina takes up the issue with the industry as well as with the TC, with the thought being that at the end of the day, the goal should really be even broader than just what's North Carolina's rule going to be, but it's not part of Addendum 4, so we can't go far astray on that issue today. There hasn't been public comment, but in a conservation neutral or even conservation positive way, I think we can work on this issue of mesh sizes and size limits and have a more effective management measure. So I can't make that motion, and I can't vote on that motion, but if someone did make that motion and I was allowed to vote, I'd be voting for it. All I can do is offer my opinion, so, but I would urge people to follow that approach.
Louis, you want to make a motion?
I'd rather Mitch make it, but I'll make it. I'll move that the North Carolina proposal be approved for 1 year.
Thanks, Louis. Have a second? Got Lauren. All right, so we got a motion and a second by Lauren to approve North Carolina proposal for 1 year. Deliberation on the motion? I think we've already heard a lot of the different perspectives on it.
Will you vote with me?
Everybody clear what the motion is? Emerson?
Thank you. I have a question up on the slide that was just up there relative to the, I think it was 7% retention with 1/1/2 and 13% half by half for eels. Is that significantly different? Is there a statistical significance there between those two? I mean, just because one is 7% and one is 13%, there may not be any statistical significance there.
I don't know if Kate or Sheila could answer that question.
That was analysis that was provided by North Carolina and was included in draft addendum 3. I would have to go back and check with the report if there was statistical significance in that difference, but I can get back to you on that.
I think, Dennis, you want to speak in favor or against the motion?
I think just a question.
Okay, go ahead, Dennis.
I think it just relates to the answer, but I was going to ask if this business of a 13% reduction or a 7% reduction was reviewed by the technical committee, and it obviously hasn't, so that influences, I think, my decision making.
All right, any other comments on the motion? Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so I understand the intent and upshot of this motion, if it were to be approved, it would allow North Carolina to move forward with a change to its regulations to enact a 1/2 by 1/2 inch regulation, which would be consistent with the standard set forth in the addendum. And as such, I feel comfortable approving it for that reason. I mean, I understand that currently that it would be a less conservative approach than what you have now, but I think from an equity and fairness standpoint, I'm comfortable with the approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I got Louis.
Yeah, at my peril, I will speak again. The size limit's 9 inches, so I don't know that we're seeing a lot of undersized eels in either of the two panels, to get to Emerson's comment. But again, my intent would be to go home, find out how the industry would like to promote this. I have no problem going with the Cullen panel, Marty, and requiring that through proclamation, and that would maintain our compliance. I just need the time to do it, and this year would give me that time to do it. And in terms of what we're getting ready to do in Addendum 4, I'm assuming that we're all going to go home with quotas. So once we catch our quota, we're going to have to close. So it's not going to result in more or less harvest above and beyond our quota. So thank you for your support on this motion.
All right, you got John. You want to speak in favor or against the motion?
More of a question. Go ahead. Mr. Chair, I'm just curious as to if this is approved and North Carolina eelers go through the expense of changing their pots, how are we going to come back next year and tell them, oh, it was just a mistake, we want you to change back to the escape panel? So even though we're saying for 1 year, I think if this is approved, it'll be permanent. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
In favor of the motion, but I also would hope that when the technical committee looks at the information, this idea of statistical significance can be looked at, but at the same time, it would be good to know why exactly the recommendation was to maintain management measures that were in place, even though they were more restrictive than those were advanced by Addendum 3. And I would suppose part of that might be a landings issue, to keep landings from increasing, but I don't know that, and it'd be good to know that response when the technical committee goes through this deliberation.
I can briefly speak to the PDT's deliberation in the development of draft addendum 3. We did look at that issue. It was consistent with the initial FMP, and also in recognition of the fact that the modifications to gear can be costly. The PDT recommended maintaining that same language from the FMP that states that have more conservative measures be required to maintain those. And we basically, with the 1/2 inch mesh requirement, bring everyone up to a baseline, while providing that little bit of conservation benefit. But the PDT had discussions where they did not want to see all states revert down to the 1/2, and potentially lose some of that conservation benefit that was gained through the addendum.
Thanks, Kate. Adam?
Thank you. I think both the last speakers touched on the two issues I was going to address. One is that if we're going to approve this motion, it's not going to be for just 1 year. By having that in here, we're just leaving ourselves more work for the future, quite frankly. I think it would behoove the board to remove that moving forward. And secondly would be what was previously in the addendum. I would encourage the board to revisit that. If we're going to say 1/2 is good enough, then there's no point in leaving in the stipulation that if you're currently more conservative, that you have to stay there. We're basically setting a precedent here that was saying we're moving forward. We're saying everybody should be at 1/2, and this board should find some way to move forward, again, so we don't have to take up our time taking these up individually moving forward.
So Adam, was that a suggestion to amend, to remove for 1 year or not?
I'm not going to make an amendment to the motion, Mr. Chairman, but I'm going to leave that low-hanging fruit out there.
All right, thanks. Got Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I can support this, but I do have two questions before we vote. I think Marty said that some of these pots, people are actually putting these escape panels on the bottom of the pots. And is North Carolina going to deal with that through the regulations to make sure that the escape panels are actually can actually be used as escape panels? If they're on the bottom, I think the efficiency is going to be impacted. And two, several of the comments that were just made, specifically Adams, can North Carolina, if we do this for 1 year, are they going to be able to, and we reverse decision, are you going to be able to make a change and ensure this isn't a 2-year proposal?
Lewis?
Yes, I think, as Marty said, I think a lot of the pots are already 1/2. So requiring an escape panel be incorporated into the body of the pot in a certain location where it is effective, I could implement in 48 hours through proclamation if that was what was required to maintain compliance with the plan.
All righty. Yeah, Marty wanted to say something, recognizing that the TC and AP hasn't had a chance to look at this. Go ahead, Marty.
The question I have to all of you is, why would you catch something you can't sell?
Go ahead, Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this motion, but the buyers control what you're going to sell. You can have all the small eels you want, and you can't sell it. For instance, if you go to spiny dogfish, we got loads of spiny dogfish, but we can't sell it. We can't make anything with it. The industry, the fishing industry is controlled by what the buyers will buy. And Marty can say, well, they're there, but if he won't buy it, or if he won't give any price for it, he won't catch it. For instance, a friend of mine, Tommy Ledman, didn't go eeling this fall because the price of eels was low. He went oystering. That's what happens in the market. So, and I don't see why North Carolina has to be more restrictive than Maryland or anyone else. If it's 1/2, I think that's what it ought to be, 1/2. You should be able to go to that. I just don't think it's fair to make them be at a higher gauge of wire. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the past few board meetings we've had about eel, we keep coming back to let's follow the TC recommendations on these things. This was
in the previous addendum that we passed, so it went through the TC, it went through the PDT review, to keep in that more restrictive language, and we've done that. And as I said, we keep hearing people saying we should follow TC advice, and yet time and time again with this EEL plan, we're talking about doing things that are very different. So just something to consider there.
Thanks, John. Is there anybody that has not spoken on the motion that would like to speak? All right, let's allow for a 30-second caucus on the motion. All right, Joe, you need me to read it? You have it? Okay. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Yeah. Thank you. All those opposed, please raise your right hand. Thank you. Any abstentions? 2 null votes. Motion carries. One follow-up question, given the board has passed this motion for clarification going forward. What would the board like to see in 1 year to evaluate this plan? Do you want the technical committee just to review the proposal? Do you want North Carolina to submit information after this year? Any suggestions on that so we can give some direction to North Carolina and the staff? Dave?
Yeah, I think get that input from the TC. If there's more information that North Carolina can or wants to provide, great, but I'd like to hear from the TC on it.
Any objection to that? Okay. All righty. Yeah, Doug?
Yeah, this discussion that we've had here and we've had in previous meetings have left me a little concerned here that maybe we didn't pick the right mesh size here for a 9-inch size limit. And the comment that we received, both at the AP and the commission, some of the commissioners here, was that this was an appropriate size limit, because we had an option. Didn't we have an option of 1/2 inch by 1 inch in the plan originally? And we chose 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. At least I made the decision because I heard 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch is appropriate is the best one for a 9-inch size limit. And this is making me a little concerned that maybe we should have gone with a 1/2 inch by 1 inch. So the point of me making that is I'd like to have technical committee comment on what is the appropriate mesh size for a 9-inch minimum size limit.
So, well, Kate's going to provide a response, but if there is that question out there, perhaps when the technical committee reviews North Carolina's proposal, they can include that evaluation and bring it back to the board as well. All right. Did you want to say anything, Kate?
We did look at the evaluation of that, and the 1/2 by 1/2 was it was a little bit lower than a 9-inch minimum size, and the board was made aware of that and has had discussions on a bycatch or a tolerance for undersized eels at the last 2 meetings. It's, I think, in 8 and 11/12 maybe, or it's very close to 9 inches, but it is under 9 inches, that size that is associated with the 1/2 by 1/2 inch mesh.
Richard, you okay? All right. So we'll do that. We'll ask the technical committee to just re-examine that if there is some concerns related to that objective being met with that 1/2 by 1/2 when they look at the North Carolina proposal. Next on the agenda is the technical committee report, and just to kind of manage our expectations for today, we're going to try to break it at 12:30 for lunch. Ideally, we were hoping to get through the working group recommendations so everybody could have that before them as we break. We'll see if we can get that far. It's taking a little bit longer with some of the early agenda items. But just before I turn over to Sheila in regard to the technical committee report, just want to recall that we had a lengthy meeting at the last August meeting related to yellow eels, and we ended that meeting with the board asking that a working group be formed to look at options that would achieve the technical committee's recommendations for yellow eels and also for glass eels. There was some discussion about a discrepancy in draft addendum 4 as to what that baseline for reduction shall be. Should it be based upon landings in 2010, given that was the last assessment? Should it be based upon the 98 to 2010 average landings? So to offer clarity to the working group, the technical committee was tasked with clarifying what baseline period the reduction shall be made off of. So Sheila is going to report on that. There was also the issue related to the multiple species of eels that may be encountered. So I'm going to turn over to Sheila, and she's going to provide us a foundation of information for our discussions later this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So move to the next slide. Sorry. All right. So Tom gave a good overview of the information that we were tasked with. We had to look at the quota recommendations from the stock assessment, the identification of glass eels if we have confusion with other species, and finally a review of Dr. Cadron's white paper that was given out at the last board meeting. So we'll start with the quota recommendations. So the technical committee we met earlier in September, and we discussed the recommended quotas, and the technical committee continues to recommend that the quota be an average of landings from 1998 to 2010 for both life stages of yellow and glass eel fishery. So that time period was considered for the entire stock assessment, and it also includes some variability in the fishery, which you wouldn't get if you just picked 1 year out of that time series. The technical committee also recommends a reduction from those average landings. So the average landings for yellow eels during that time period would be 907,669 pounds. For glass eels, it would be 5,293 pounds. When the technical committee was asked whether or not we had a recommendation for how much reduction should be taken from that level, the stock assessment did not identify a reduction amount. We have no amount that we can tell you that would ensure benefits in rebuilding of the fishery stock. However, looking at the variability in the harvest from 1998 to 2010 in the yellow eel fishery, a coefficient of variation, a CV, was assigned to those values, and it considered a 12% reduction from the average landings would be what we would consider a measurable reduction in the fishery. If you want to move to the next slide. So this slide shows the harvest landings from 1998 to 2010 in the blue bars, and then the more recent landings in the red bars. So the technical committee wants you to consider the average landings from 1998 to 2010, and that's indicated by the black bar all the way on the right. And with a 12% reduction, that would ensure that the fishery is reduced from most years of harvest between 1998 and 2010. That would be down to 798,750 pounds. When looking at the glass eel fishery, we used the same analysis looking at the variation in harvest from 1998 to 2010, and that analysis showed that a 70% reduction would be necessary to achieve the same kind of measurable result in fishery harvest. But however, the technical committee looked at that and felt that that was probably unnecessary because we could not ensure that that level of reduction would result in stock rebuilding, and that we thought it was more appropriate that the glass eel reduction should be considered something similar to the yellow eel reduction, which would be 12% again. To the next. So this slide just indicates, again, the harvest for glass eels from 1998 to 2010 in the blue bars. The red bars are the more recent landings. The average from 1998 to 2010 is 5,293 pounds, and that's indicated in the black bar. And then finally, a 12% reduction from that would be 4,658 pounds, indicated in the green bar. Moving on to identification of glass eels. There was a question at the last board meeting whether or not there may be some other eel species besides American eels being collected in our young of a year surveys. And the most significant concern would be the speckled worm eel, which has a glacial phase that may be confused with the American eel glacial phase. And it appears that the issue might be most significant from North Carolina and south down to Florida. However, the North Carolina survey at the Beaufort Bridge Net survey indicates all species collected to, or all fish collected to species, so there should be no confusion between American eels and speckled worm eels in that survey. In Florida, all glass eels are also identified, and they do collect speckled worm eels, and those are removed from the analysis when they do their young of the year survey. In Georgia, as part of Addendum 3, their annual assessment is now on yellow eels, so there's no confusion there with the speckled worm eel in that survey. And finally, in South Carolina, their surveys are conducted about 40 kilometers upstream, and the technical committee feels that it's likely that speckled worm eels are not involved in those collections, but the state of North Carolina has not actually assessed whether those eels are in the young of the year American eel collections or not. So they'll look at that in the future, but we don't think this is a significant issue. In the future, we will also consider looking at our northern collections of young of the year surveys to see if they might be in states north of North Carolina. Likely with ocean conditions warming, we might see that population of speckled worm eels becoming more popular in the northern states. So we'll just keep an eye on that, but we don't think that this is a significant issue at this time for the young of the year surveys. And then finally, at the last board meeting, Dr. Cadron had released a white paper, and it was the day before the board meeting, so the technical committee did not have time to review that paper prior to the last board meeting. But the technical committee has since reviewed that paper and found that it does not present any new information from the stock assessment, and it does not change the recommendations from the 2012 stock assessment that the stock is depleted. There were some issues that were identified in the white paper. One was the geographic range for the stock assessment. It indicated that we only considered U.S. stocks in the stock assessment. That was made very clear in the stock assessment report, as well as a peer review, that it was not, it did not encompass the entire geographic range of eels. And we intend down the road in future stock assessments to try bring in Canadian indices as well, and possibly Gulf of Mexico indices into new stock assessments. It also indicated there's some positive indicators and recruitments in that paper. We were unsure how familiar Dr. Cadron was with some of those surveys that he cited, and he also did not cite some of the indicators that were showing negative indices. So it looked like it was kind of biased in just showing the indices that might show some positive recruitment. So the technical committee feels that even if the stock may be improving, it's a very slow upturn from some very low level. And there's still much uncertainty with that. And then finally, the Fish and Wildlife Service ESA review, there was a suggestion in that paper that the ESA review was in 2007 was more encompassing than the stock assessment. And frankly, the stock assessment looked at data more thoroughly than the endangered species review in 2007. And the endangered species review was also for a different purpose. Looking at reductions for fishery is a very different assessment than what you do to look at endangered species status. So it wasn't an appropriate comparison at that time. That's the end of the technical committee report. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Questions for Sheila? Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Sheila. And this may be a slight follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. So Sheila, the 907,671 baseline amount of yellow eel harvest, what is the benefit of that in terms of, is it looked at as a cap basis, as a place to reduce from? Does it capture the variability among the states that have been the largest harvesters over that time? Does it also represent what happened back in 1998 forward? So I guess what I'm asking is, it seems on the one hand, 907,671 pounds is a place to start. It's a baseline, and you can make reductions from there, which the technical committee has come up with different scenarios, and the latest one is 12%. But what would be the best way, since the technical committee hasn't done this, to take a 12% reduction? This can be a board decision as we go through the working group today, but can you give an idea from the technical committee? You've established a baseline. You know there's variability not only interannually, but through the 1998-2010 period, and you know there's variability state by state. So do you have any comments on maybe the best suggestion on how to take a 12% reduction? That's a long one.
Right, if that's a question of allocation, that's not something the technical committee would comment on.
Rob?
Mr. Chairman, I contend that's not allocation. It is a question of, there is a baseline. The technical committee has recommended a 12% reduction. Does the technical committee think it should have any advice on how the 12% reduction should be taken? Just as if the technical committee has advice on other issues, such as Dr. Cadron's paper that he just did, or on issues of perhaps how the mesh sizes should stay in place or not stay in place. So I think the technical committee might have a comment, but if not.
So Rob, are you asking, are there other management options than setting a quota for achieving a 12% reduction?
No, Mr. Chairman, I'm just trying to figure out that this latest information on a 12% reduction, I'll give a hint. One simple way would be to just take 12% from every state. I mean, that's certainly something to think about. And what I want to know is, would that satisfy the technical committee? Do they think that's a good way to have a 12% reduction? And the reason I ask that is because the fisheries have changed. We looked a lot about 2011, 2013 data. We know the fisheries have changed, yet we're using a stanza as a baseline which encompasses 1998 to 2010. A lot of those years no longer pertain. For example, last meeting, Dr. Daniel indicated there was no way that he could go home and say there'd be a 50% reduction to North Carolinians. But at the same time, you have to go back in time to see that type of harvest. So perhaps this is too encompassing right now, and I'll bring it up a little bit more later. But my real idea is, if there's a 12% reduction, why can't we be simple about it?
Yeah, I think I understand. We'll probably have further deliberation when we get to the final actions of draft addendum 4. It sounds like it comes down to, what baseline do you take that 12% from, and it comes back to, an allocation discussion. Do you use recent landings, historic landings, mixture, blend? But I think the TC is saying that, you should reduce your landings from that 98 to 10 average, and specifically now a 12% reduction from that. Rob? Go ahead, Rob.
So very quickly, then, does the technical committee think it is the amount of landings? Because the assessment ended in 2010, the assessment years are in there for 1998 to 2010. Is that really the driving force of the technical committee?
Yes, because those years were used for the stock assessment, 1998 to 2010. The stock was determined depleted from that status. We recommend a reduction occur from those harvest landings. So instead of taking 1 year, we took an average of all years within the stock assessment time period.
Okay, Rob.
Last one. Has the dynamics of the fishery changed compared to that baseline time period, 1998 to 2010?
State-by-state variability each year changes a lot. But overall, the coast-wide harvest has been relatively stable, right around 1 million pounds. And the technical committee views this as one population, so we're concerned about coast-wide harvest as a whole and not necessarily what individual states are harvesting.
Thanks, Sheila. Rob. Jim?
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks, Sheila. That was a good report. And I don't want to get into the quota discussion yet, but I want to get one question answered. I know it's been brought up to TC that, that particularly for the New York situation, that we weren't recording landings for those earlier years. The landings were actually lower, and that we couldn't include 2011 beyond because that was not part of the stock assessment, so I understand the reasoning behind that. But the problem we have, though, is that the data is wrong in the assessment then, because we excluded a lot of landings. So the simple question at this point is, if those landings had been included, and in New York's case, you would have maybe gone up another 50,000 pounds or whatever. I know you can't quantify it, but how would that have affected the stock assessment? Would it have been higher, lower, or what do you think?
I don't think the landings themselves would have changed the outcome of the stock assessment of the depleted status. It may change this graph potentially if you have more landings to be included in that. But without those numbers, there's nothing more that we could do with this assessment other than take an average of what landings we had reported.
Thank you. Sheila, I had one question. You had mentioned that the technical committee did not believe that a 70% reduction in glass eels would ensure stock rebuilding and defaulted to a 12% recommendation. Can you explain how the technical committee came to that recommendation?
I wanted to be clear that even a 12% reduction, because we don't have targets established in the stock assessment, won't guarantee a stock rebuilding either. So we felt that a 12% reduction just accounts for the variability in the harvest, and that most years, if they went under the average harvest from 1998 to 2010, you would have a reduction in the fishery. If you go with just the average level of 907,000 pounds, it means half the years you're still going to harvest more than what you would have harvested anyway. So with a 12% reduction in the yellow eel fishery, because there's some variability in the yellow eel harvest, but it's not a great variability. You're still bouncing around 1 million pounds. That would be something we would consider measurable, but still not necessarily something that would ensure stock rebuilding. Doing the same analysis for glass eels, where that fishery is much more variable and the pounds landed are much smaller, we didn't see that it would be very consistent to apply that same methodology of a 70% reduction to that fishery. Then it might be easier just to hold it across the board, because we're still looking at one species and one population. The glass eels are not a different species. It's still the same species, and we felt that 12% was still appropriate.
Thanks, Sheila. All right, seeing no other questions, we'll move on to agenda. Mitch? Go ahead, Mitch.
Sheila, you've sort of indicated this with your last comments a little bit, but I just want to be clear. The TC cannot point to any analysis that indicates how a 12% reduction in yellow eel or glass eel catches would impact the overall populations. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's no targets established in the stock assessment, so we cannot ensure that a 12% reduction would make a change in the population.
Well, it's in fact, isn't it true that the TC does not have any population estimate in the first place? Not only do we not have targets, we don't have an estimate of what the population is at this time. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
The stock assessment included a DBSRA model that purported to estimate the total population of eels in the U.S., but in fact that model was rejected by the peer reviewer, so we can't rely on that to estimate what the total population is. Am I right about that?
Yes, that is correct.
Sheila, I only have one other question. You indicated that even at 12%, the technical committee can't assure anybody that populations will rebuild with a 12% reduction. I heard that right, did I?
Yes, you did.
Okay, so, but my question is, last year at about this time, the TC chairman indicated that it was the mood of the group, of the stock assessment committee. He said, I think the SAS feels that period really contributed to our present level of abundance, which we do consider depleted. He said that you can see we've come down to a low level from that and we are rebuilding. And then he presented us various models based on just the DBSRA that at the current, depending on certain assumptions that were plugged into the model, that rebuilding would continue, but at different levels. And but he didn't question a year ago that stocks currently were rebuilding. Has the TC concluded at this point that that's not true, that stocks are not rebuilding?
The only thing that has changed since last year as far as the stock assessment is concerned is that we've reevaluated the Young of the Year survey, and we are seeing no trend in the Young of the Year survey. That's the only survey, the indice that has been updated since the stock assessment.
And in fact, we have two Young of the Year indices, coastwide GLMs, and neither one of them show a trend up or down for 10 or 20 years. Is that correct?
Right, there's no trend in any of the state indices at this time.
Okay, and what about when you aggregate all the state indices and create a coastwide index?
That has not been updated since the stock assessment in 2012.
All right, thanks, Sheila.
Thanks, Mitch. Sheila. Got Emerson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Sheila, for your presentation. In terms of the 12%, you came up with the 12% based on the CVs to account for the annual variation for total landings or the state-by-state landings?
It was for total landings each year, combined all states together.
So that 12% figure then just accounts for the variability, really. It has no other basis. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Sheila, if you covered this already, my apologies, but I'm so used to control rules, and they give you a lot of comfort to have control rules. So with a depleted status, I don't think I've ever heard exactly what that is. Is it something that's quantitative, that you can tell us not only what level of depletion there is, but also with another assessment or an update or however that's planned, will the technical committee be able to know whether or not it is still depleted, not depleted? How does that all work at this point? What are the deliberations on that?
The depletion recommendation coming from the assessment was based on the overall indices that the SAS and the technical committee were reviewing in light of the recognition of the reduction in landings, neutral or downward trends in some indices at the state level and aggregated. So at that time, we were not working under a standard definition by the Commission of a depleted designation, but in light of the fact that the model was rejected by the peer review panel, the SAS and technical committee still felt that the situation still warranted the depleted status rather than the overfishing status, which was taken off the table. And then moving forward with the how an update could occur, if one was planned from the board, the technical committee and SAS would have to, review the information, compare it to what was compiled at the time of the assessment, and then try to make the best determination. They did do a review of the Young of the Year indices at the board's request and presented that information, and that was just the state-specific ones. And looking at that information, so it wasn't aggregated, still felt that the depleted designation was appropriate.
Okay, Mitch and then Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that clarification, Kate, because I think Rob had asked a pretty important and fair question. We've noticed in the press has reported on the ASMFC actions regarding eel, and basically, to some extent, the press treats depleted as something that's awfully dramatic. I haven't seen anyone use the word extinction or endangered in connection with depletion, but that is the tone that a lot of the press takes, and that now here in the Commission's primary eel meeting itself, one of our commissioners who voted to accept that stock assessment, as we all did, acknowledges that it's not even clear what depleted means. Kate, you said that the peer reviewers, after they had rejected the DBSRA, nonetheless accepted the conclusion that the stocks are depleted. And I would ask you, you've cited the Mann-Kendall analysis as the primary source for supporting the contention that we have depletion. And as I looked at the stock assessment this weekend, I saw that the Mann-Kendall analysis showed 34 trends were neutral, 12 trends were downward, and 4 were upward. Is that the primary indicator upon which the SAS concluded that we're in a depleted status?
That was one of many different types of analysis that the SAS used. It was not the primary one, and taken into account all of the different analysis, that was how the peer review panel and the SAS and the technical committee came to the recommendation.
And the peer reviewers were aware that the Lake Ontario populations had completely collapsed, 20, 25 years ago. Is that not correct? In fact, one of the peer reviewers was Gérald Chaput from Canada.
We select qualified peer review panelists. They were aware of the history of some of the Canadian background, so I cannot say how much knowledge they have of it.
And my last question is, the Geological Service had says, and I think that our friends at Fish and Wildlife Service, or maybe the TC itself, has presented to this commission before, statistics indicating that, some huge percentage, and don't quote me on numbers, but it was at 80%, 90% of all freshwater habitat to eels has been blocked over the last half a century because of obstructions. That was presented also as part of the stock assessment, yes?
Yes, I believe there's information in the stock assessment about habitat loss.
All right, so it's quite possible that when the peer reviewers accepted they rejected the model as for management use, but they accepted the conclusion that we're depleted. It's possible they're just saying, well, based on the fact that Lake Ontario populations collapsed 25 years ago and never came back, and based on the fact that we blocked almost 80 to 90% of the freshwater habitat for eels, who would argue that the stock is depleted from historic norms? Is there really any... Did they say anything more than that to indicate that they felt that in the U.S. fishery, including estuarine populations, that the stocks were down?
Tom, a point of order.
Yeah, Dennis, I was just getting to that myself.
I think we're having a debate between two people, and it's not. You haven't even recognized the gentleman for follow-up questions, and this is, in my opinion, has gone a little far and a little far afield.
I'll leave my further questions till we discuss the management options in the working group proposals. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis, and thanks, Mitch. I got Roy.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to reiterate what I thought I heard this morning. It was concluded based on the juvenile eel surveys that we can't show a significant increase or decrease, that there's too much variation in the annual abundance of the glass eels. We've also heard that the commercial landings have varied from 98 to 2013 with no apparent trend. Am I correct in both of those assumptions?
That's my understanding. Sheila, correct?
And yet our technical committee is still suggesting to us nonetheless a 12% reduction. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Sheila, do you have any comment to that? Is that correct characterization?
We did not look at a trend in harvest from 1998 to 2013. So we aren't saying it's increasing or decreasing from then.
Well, I didn't look at it from a statistical point of view, but just glancing at the landings figures that are in our document package, I see no apparent trend in the landings from 98 to 2013, at least none I can discern. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. All right, let's move forward, and Kate's going to give an overview of the options in draft addendum 4.
A very quick overview, Mr. Chairman. So just as a refresher, moving forward through the options in the addendum, it does address glass, silver, and yellow eel fisheries. For the glass eel fishery, option 1, the status quo. Option 2, the 2014 management measures, where Maine would be held to their 11,000 approximately pound quota, with South Carolina maintaining their permit system as they have in place. Option 3 is the closure of the glass eel fishery, and this is either immediate, delayed, or at a time frame as specified by the board. Option 4 would implement a quota for the glass eel fisheries, and there are options that are contained in the addendum for different quota amounts. Option 5, if the board chooses to implement a quota system, then they have a mechanism to address overages. Option 6 was a glass eel harvest allowance based on stock enhancement programs, and essentially this would allow states to harvest glass eels for improvements to, for example, passage or increase glass eel survivability. And different options are presented to cap that harvest based on the restoration amounts that are able to be quantified. Option 7 was the aquaculture quota, and this would allocate a portion of any quota if the board moved forward with a quota for the glass eel fishery and allocate it for aquaculture purposes. Option 7 deals with aquaculture permitting and specifies that any harvest of glass eels for aquaculture purposes must be collected through an aquaculture permit as opposed to a commercial or research permit. Option 9 would implement daily trip-level reporting for states with a glass eel fishery, and Option 10 would require states with a glass eel fishery to implement a life cycle survey. Moving through to the yellow eel fishery, option 1 is the status quo. The next 4 options deal with quota and allocation. Keep in mind all the quota options use 2010 as the starting point for allocation for the development of the total coastwide quota. The base years for determining the allocation do vary by option. The PDT notes that there are a significant number of alternatives in setting the allocation years, but the ones that are presented, the 4 ones that are presented, really do represent the range potentially that could be considered. For each one of these alternatives, there will be states that will be negatively impacted or will be benefited as a result of the sometimes large annual variability in harvest, as we have seen. So options 2 and 3, I would also like to point out, use a filtering method. This filtering criteria is a way to increase the equity in the allocation given the variability in the state landings. And these 3 filtering criteria include that states be allocated a minimum quota of 2,000 pounds to prevent any administrative burden, although we do note that this might result in a large increase in the poundage that is given to some states. For example, New Hampshire started out with 134 pounds and would move up to 2,000 pounds. The second filtering criteria is that no state is allocated a quota more than 10,000 pounds above its 2010 harvest, and the third criteria is that no state would be allocated a quota that is more than a 15% reduction from its 2010 harvest. So the different tables, Table 5 presents the quota options under Option 2 with a 10 and a 20% reduction. Option 3, Option 2 uses 2011 through 2013 as the base years. Option 3 uses 2002 to 2012 as the base years with the same filtering method as under Option 2. And again, here's the table with the 10 and 20% reductions. Option 4, this is again using the coastwide quota set at the 2010 harvest levels. The allocation here is based on the average of the 3 highest landing values from 2002 to 2012 with no filtering. Table 7 includes those quota options with a 10 and a 20% reduction. And lastly, Option 5 is a weighted yellow eel quota where the 3 highest landing years from the period 2004 to 2013 were averaged and then weighted at 30%, which was combined with the average landings from 2011 to 2013, which was weighted at 70%. And this is described in Table 8 in the document. If the board chooses to implement a quota system, Options 6 and 7 addresses quota overages and quota transfers. Option 8 focuses on a catch cap. This is based off of the 2010 harvest levels that we just saw in all of the quota options. Under this option, states and jurisdictions would be allowed to fish until the cap is reached. Once the cap is reached, all states and jurisdictions would be required to close all directed fisheries and prohibit landings. A catch cap does help to control the amount of mortality that is occurring on the species without needing the difficult decision of allocations by states. However, the PDT notes that we would still need timely reporting. There is no state-specific payback mechanism. It may promote a derby-style fishery, and there could be the potential loss of the historic fall and winter fisheries. And the graph provided in the document just shows the variability by month in landings averaged out on the coast. The addendum also addresses the silver eel fishery. As you remember, under Addendum 3, New York was granted a 1-year exemption from the time closure requirements that were implemented. So option 1, let me just make it clear that this would maintain the status quo, and so New York's exemption would expire on December 31st, and they would have to revert to the Addendum 3 requirements. Option 2 would be an extension of the sunset provision at a time frame specified by the board and allow the continuation of the New York's silver eel weir fishery in the Delaware River. Option 3 deals with effort reductions, which would essentially limit the weir fishery from August 15th to September 30th. Option 4 is a transferable license cap. There are 3 alternative management framework plans contained in the addendum. The first being the fishing mortality plan, which essentially states that states must assess the mortality that is occurring within their jurisdiction, and once assessed, they could reallocate a portion of that mortality to any fishery or for aquaculture or research purposes, provided there is an overall net gain in conservation. Under the aquaculture plan, states would be allowed to harvest a maximum of 200 pounds of glass eels annually from within their waters for use in domestic aquaculture purposes, provided they can objectively show that the harvest will occur from a watershed that minimally contributes to the spawning stock of American eel. And the last plan is if the board implements a quota, a state may request a transfer from one quota, from one life stage to another. So for example, from a yellow eel quota to a glass eel fishery based on the life history characteristics inherent in that state or jurisdiction. And that concludes my brief report on draft addendum 4. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Kate. Any burning questions for Kate? Is that not burning, Liz? All right, because we'll obviously be talking about this afternoon. It is... It's 12:35. I really think it'd be beneficial for the board to hear the work group recommendations before we break. It probably would take like 10 minutes. Is there any objection with going through those recommendations before we break? Tom, is there an objection?
Summers have been sitting here since 8 o'clock this morning. I mean, and what seems to be take 10 minutes winds up being 20, 30 minutes the way we're going right now. So I'm just saying, if we're going to make 10 minutes, make it 10 minutes.
This is my suggestion, that we give the report, but hold questions until after lunch. Sound good? All right. So first, following our last board meeting, the working group was formed as charged. Membership, you should have a memo dated October 23rd. We had really good representation. We had Terry from Maine, Richie from New Hampshire, Russ from New Jersey, John from Delaware, myself, Lewis from North Carolina, and Ross Self from South Carolina. I think that we had a really effective and efficient set of meetings. A lot of that goes to Kate's work in between when we met. We did have one conference call, and then we did have a face-to-face meeting for which everyone thought that having that face-to-face meeting was very beneficial. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through our recommendations for glass eels and then yellow eels. And what we tried to do is, in this report, we try to clearly identify the guidance that has been provided to the board from the technical committee, what our working group recommendation is, and then our rationale for that. So in regards to glass eels, when the work group had a conference call and met, the technical committee guidance at that point in time was to reduce harvest from 1998 to 2010, which was just under 5,300 pounds. As you heard today, the technical committee sent a memo last week now suggesting a 12% reduction. That information was not available when the working group met, so the guidance we had was going off of the baseline of 98 to 2010. We had a lot of discussion in regards to the glass eel fishery, taking in consideration the socioeconomic importance, the uncertainty, and what conservation benefit would be by taking a reduction to the TC recommendation. And we ultimately came to a recommendation to support option 2 with modification that would set a quota for Maine at 9,688 pounds. And that is what was harvested in 2014. It's below their current quota, but what was harvested in 2014. The working group did note that this was above the technical committee recommendation, and we wanted to explain our rationale for that recommendation. One is that there's uncertainty in the added conservation benefits with going beyond that level of reduction, recognizing the socioeconomic importance to that fishery, expected increased levels of poaching that would occur with significant cutbacks, and the expected inability for Maine to complete the important life history study that has been recommended by the technical folks. We do recommend that this quota be reevaluated after 3 years at a time which Maine hopefully will have information from their life cycle monitoring program. So, as you can see, the working group really tried to find that balance with one of the important values that we adopted in our strategic plan, which is balancing that conservation benefit with the local economies, the important economics related to our local economies. We did agree that there should be a quota overage payback provision. I should also mention South Carolina measures, the recommendation was they would remain the same as they were in 2014. There would be a quota payback provision under option 5. The work group did support option 6, which is the glass eel harvest allowance based on stock enhancement programs. Would support option 6C, which would allow a 25% harvest of glass eels based upon the contribution expected from that stock enhancement. Supported option 8, aquaculture permitting. Supported option 9 and 10 related to reporting requirements and monitoring requirements, but did recommend that a state that harvests less than 750 pounds of glass eels would be exempt from the reporting and monitoring to alleviate the economic burden that would require. Moving on to yellow eels. Again, at the time we met, the recommendation from the technical committee was to reduce landings from the 90 to 2010 average, which was 907,000 pounds. We had a lot of discussions in regards to this allocation. On our first conference call, we tried to take off our state-specific interest and talked about what are the principles by which we should base these allocation decisions. It was like fairness, no one state should be disproportionately impacted positively or negatively, items like that. And we took a glance at the allocation options 2, 3, 4, and 5, and Kate provided some information that was very insightful, and it allowed the working group on the first conference call to remove options 3 and 4 because it was clear that it was unfairly treating certain states. For example, option 4, which would reduce the coastwide harvest by about 92,000 pounds, Maryland's harvest would drop by 130,000 pounds. So it was very clear that some states were being disproportionately impacted and other states were positively being benefiting from those options. We also asked Kate to look further into option 5 by applying these filters to option 5 to try to address those disproportional impacts. And the group did think that the coastal cap was an option worth pursuing. When we got back together for a full meeting, we were able to work through those limited options and come to a recommendation. That recommendation was to support option 8, which is a catch cap, a soft coastal cap for yellow eels. This And recognizing that, that was largely recognized that this fishery, as Roy Miller had said, has not varied much over the last 15 years. But recognizing that there is a need to keep that harvest from expanding, we did look at an option that would look at a 16% reduction that would get us to the baseline recommendation of the technical committee at the time we met, which was 907,000 pounds. And we set forth some triggers as we monitor this the landings under this soft coastal cap. We want to ensure that landings don't increase substantially. So we decided that it would be good to set some triggers, and the first trigger would be is that if the coast-wide landings exceeded 10% of that 98 to 2010 average, we would immediately go to a state-by-state quota allocation, and that would be based upon option 2. The other trigger was if the coast-wide cap exceeded that 907,000 pounds in 2 consecutive years, whether it exceeded it by 1% or 9%, if we saw that for 2 consecutive years, we would also go to implement a state-by-state quota system. Given the amount of time we've had discussing these issues, we thought it would be really beneficial for this board to hardwire that state-by-state quota system into the actions that we take today. And based upon our review of the different options, we felt that option 2 was the most equitable option for all the states. And with option 2, with a 16% reduction, we would keep the state-by-state quota at the 907,000 pound baseline recommendation. When we used option 2 and applied a 16% reduction, the overall landings by the quotas left about just under 14,000 pounds, and the working group recommendation was to reallocate that 14,000 pounds to those states that have been negatively impacted below the 2010 landings: New Jersey, Delaware, Potomac River, North Carolina, with not allocating more to Maryland given the high allocation that Maryland already has. So that allowed those states that were negatively impacted to receive a little bit more up to their 2010 level. The working group does recommend that to avoid us going forward with this recommendation and the coastal cap triggers being tripped, we don't want to find ourselves in a situation that we're not prepared to act. So the work group recommendation was the state should go forward with developing the rulemaking that would allow them to implement the state-by-state quotas if the triggers are tripped. And that could be as early as 2016 if, again, we exceeded that 10% landings trigger. Also, in regards to reporting, we need to ensure that we have the reporting systems in place to monitor state-by-state quota if we have to go down that path. So we recommend that states would move forward under this coastal cap to come back to the board at the annual meeting next year to demonstrate that they would be prepared to implement a state-by-state quota if the trigger was tripped. The working group did support the state-specific sustainable fisheries management plans under section 3.1.4. It does recommend that all requests for aquaculture harvest be first filed through the state and not directly to the commission. And lastly, we talked about the silver eel management measures that the board took at the last meeting. You see by the working group's recommendations that silver eels, glass eels, and yellow eels are all being treated differently in regards to the level of reduction, and we try to explain the rationale behind that. We recommend that since the management measures have already been adopted for silver eels, that be reevaluated when New York has some more information in regards to some of the life history studies that are being performed in New York, and that would likely be in 3 years. And in closing, we felt like we should, encourage the board chair and the commission staff to begin looking at when the next timeline would be for the next stock assessment, looking at when there would be new information to invest those resources to complete another stock assessment, which we can use to reevaluate the management measures that we move forward in addendum 4. So that's it. I think I probably went a little over 10 minutes, Tom. Apologize for that. We won't take any questions at this point, but hopefully that gives you some information to digest over lunch, and I encourage you to speak to some of the working group members if you have questions. Thanks. We'll reconvene at 1:45.
There's a few lunch options available before everyone breaks up. There's a few lunch places across the street in the shops there, Five Guys Burgers, pizza, and some other things, I believe. Also, the hotel has some bag lunches available, which I assume have sandwiches in them, those sorts of things. So there's not enough for everyone there, kind of a first